Hi everyone, I'm Any New Province, and this week we're going to find out if Epicure of Blood is possibly Pauper Playable. Epicure of Blood is a brand new creature that was released into Pauper through Core Set 2019. It costs 4 and a black for a 4/4 that says whenever you gain life, each opponent loses 1 life. While it is a precarious suggestion to play a 5-drop and expect it to survive for even a turn in the Pauper format, I'm looking forward to seeing if this deck, which I'm calling Cantrip Life, will help highlight Epicure of Blood's unique ability. First, I'm going to break down all of the cantrips that gain us life in this deck. This is going to ensure that we continuously draw effects that gain us life, triggering Epicure of Blood again and again and hopefully killing our opponent. First, we have Implement of Improvement, which costs 1 mana for an artifact that you can pay 1 and sacrifice to gain you 2 life. Also, when Implement of Improvement is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you get to draw a card. Implement of Improvement is really interesting in this deck because it triggers our creatures that care about us casting non-creature spells, but we can keep it around on the board until we have an Epicure played so that we make sure when we gain life from Implement of Improvement we get an Epicure trigger. We're also playing 4 copies of Revitalize, which is another new printing from M19. It costs 1 and a white for an instant that gains you 3 life and draws you a card. Revitalize is a pretty bad card on its own, but in this deck it helps trigger our creatures that care about non-creature spells and also gets an Epicure of Blood trigger while drawing us another card that will hopefully gain us some more life. Our last cantripping life gain spell is one of my favorites. It's Survival Cache, which costs 2 and a white for a sorcery that gains you 2 life. Then, if you have more life than an opponent, you get to draw a card. Survival Cache, being a non-creature spell that gains you life and replaces itself, is almost enough to have it included in this deck, but the really cool part about Survival Cache is that it has Rebound. Rebound says if you cast this spell from your hand, exile it as it resolves. At the beginning of your next upkeep, you may cast this card from exile without paying its mana cost. We'll get to trigger our creatures that care about non-creature spells again, gain a little bit more life, draw another card, and trigger Epicure of Blood. Our next package is full of spells that help us trigger life gain on multiple occasions, so that if we can get them and Epicure of Blood on board, we can whittle away at our opponents slowly over time. First is Pristine Talisman. It costs 3 mana for an artifact that you can tap to add colorless to your mana pool. When you do, you gain 1 life. Not only is this a great way to trigger Epicure of Blood, this also helps us play it a turn earlier, which is something you definitely want to do with high converted mana cost creatures in Pauper. Hopefully, we can get an Epicure down before our opponent draws an answer to it. We also have Student of OU Jatai, and I'm really glad we're running it here because I don't know that it would make the cut in any other deck. Student of OU Jatai costs 3 and a white for a 2/4 that allows you to gain 2 life whenever you cast a non-creature spell. We're not always going to be able to whittle away our opponent's entire life total with Epicure of Blood triggers. That's why I've included some creatures that go along with our life gain plan while helping us out with an aggressive start. First, we have Seeker of the Way, which costs 1 white for a 2/2 with Prowess, which means whenever you cast a non-creature spell, this creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Also, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, Seeker of the Way gains lifelink until end of turn. Seeker of the Way is an absolute house, and it will carry this deck to some wins that it had no place winning. At the same time, even if you're just casting instant speed non-creature spells and blocking with Seeker of the Way, you still get the life gain, and you may still get an Epicure of Blood trigger in the meantime. We're also running 3 copies of Sun Grace Pegasus. It costs 1 and a white for a 1/2 with flying and lifelink. While Sun Grace Pegasus does have a little anti-synergy with some of the interaction in our deck, I'm going to go over that next. Sun Grace Pegasus's evasion ability is very helpful if we can keep our opponent's board clear, because Epicure of Blood essentially acts as a lord for the Pegasi. Finally, instead of a 4th Pegasus, we're running a single copy of Aven Riftwatcher, which costs 2 and a white for a 2/3 flyer with Vanishing 3. Vanishing 3 means this creature enters the battlefield with 3 time counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, remove a time counter from it. When the last is removed, sacrifice it. That's okay, because when Aven Riftwatcher enters the battlefield or leaves the battlefield, you gain 2 life. That's 2 extra Epicure triggers plus 2 damage every time Aven Riftwatcher is able to attack for evasive damage against your opponent. Next up is our interaction package, and we have a ton of it because it's kind of difficult to survive in Pauper for enough time to actually cast a 5-drop at all. First, we have 3 copies of Journey to Nowhere, which costs 1 and a white for an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you get to exile target creature. any creature that you can target. When it leaves the battlefield, return the exiled creature to the battlefield under its owner's control. Unfortunately, this isn't a core Skyfisher deck, so we don't get to do very many fancy things with Journey to Nowhere. Still, I'm glad to have a couple of catch-all removal spells for the early game. Speaking of catch-all removal spells, we're running one copy of Doomblade, which costs 1 and a black for an instant that destroys target non-black creature. I've decided to include a copy of Doomblade over the 4th copy of Journey to Nowhere because sometimes your opponent can remove the Journey to Nowhere, and sometimes you can get a really good blowout with instant speed removal. We're also running 2 copies of Chainer's Edict, which costs 1 and a black for a sorcery that causes target player to sacrifice a creature. Our games will often go long enough that we can actually flash back Chainer's Edict from our graveyard by paying 5 black and exiling it. This is great because it triggers all of our creatures that care about us casting non-creature spells again while removing an additional threat from our opponent's side of the board. Our last non-land card is one of the best cards in the entire deck. This is Evenkar's Justice. It costs 2 black for a sorcery that deals 2 damage to each creature and each player. Evenkar's Justice can act as a one-time wrath very efficiently against a lot of decks, but in our deck, because our life total will be so high, it can also act as a win condition with its buyback ability. That buyback ability says you may pay an additional 3 generic mana as you cast Evenkar's Justice. If you do, put this card into your hand as it resolves. So once we build up our mana, start a little bit of ramp with our Pristine Talisman, and eventually get to 7, we can just cast Evenkar's Justice every turn, trigger our creatures that care about non-creature spells, deal 2 or 3 damage to our opponent if we have an Epicure of Blood on board. It's just amazing in this deck. Alright, let's have a look at this mana base. First, we have 4 copies of Ash Barrens. Ash Barrens over Evolving Wilds because we aren't running a ton of black, so it's okay if we have to go search it up later on. Also, Pristine Talisman can add the generic mana we need to cycle an Ash Barrens away, so it's okay having it in our hand. We have 1 Bojuka Bog in our main deck as a bit of graveyard hate. This is basically because the control matchup is so bad. Bojuka Bog enters the battlefield tapped. When it enters the battlefield, you exile all cards from target player's graveyard. If it's untapped, you can tap it for black. We have 2 copies of Kabira Crossroads, which enter the battlefield tapped, and when they enter the battlefield, they gain you 2 life, hopefully triggering Epicure of Blood. When they're untapped, you can tap them for white. We have 4 standard Pauper duels in black and white in Scoured Barrens. They enter the battlefield tapped. When they enter the battlefield, they gain you a life, and when they're untapped, you can tap them for black or white. And our last non-basics are 4 Karus in black and white. They enter the battlefield tapped. When they enter the battlefield, you return a land you control to your hand. When they're untapped, you can tap them for black and white. And there you have it, Cantrip Life. We're going to take this deck into a league at twitch.tv/AnyNewProvince. We're there every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. Atlantic time playing Possibly Pauper Playable decks. Before I go, I just want to remind you that you can like the video or subscribe to the channel down below. I'd seriously appreciate it. It's a great way to let me know you've enjoyed everything, and it really encourages me to keep making great Pauper content. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this deck tech, and hopefully I'll see you on Tuesday night.